Okay, let's unpack this. It really feels like artificial intelligence has suddenly jumped,
Mm.
from being kind of sci-fi to just being everywhere.
Oh, absolutely.
Transforming apps, changing what we expect. If you feel that, you're definitely onto something.
Yeah.
This explosion, especially with tools like ChatGPT, these generative AI things in the last few years, it's made AI part of the public conversation like never before.
That shift is definitely real, and it's
Yeah.
mostly down to what people are calling the AI boom of the 2020s.
Right?
But this boom, it didn't just, happen overnight. It was really enabled by some two big technical steps forward. Deep learning models got much more powerful.
Okay.
And then there was the introduction of the transformer architecture. That was post-2017. Those things allowed AI systems to handle and even generate really complex stuff like human language, images, with abilities we just hadn't seen.
And that's what we want to dig into today in this deep dive, right? What this really rapid advancement actually means. We're going to look specifically at the future of teaching and learning that's getting a lot of attention,
A huge amount.
but also zoom out a bit. Look at the bigger picture, the societal opportunities, the pretty significant risks, and just the big questions AI is forcing us all to think about.
Yeah, and to help us navigate that, we've pulled from a couple of key sources. We've got a recent report from the U.S. Department of Education. It's called Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Teaching and Learning.
Okay, so focus on education.
Right, really targeted look there. And then we've also got a broader overview from Wikipedia, which, covers the history, the goals, all the different applications, and this fast-moving area of ethics and regulation around AI.
So the idea here is to try and cut through some of the hype, maybe the noise too, highlight the really important bits from these sources, and hopefully give you a clearer picture of where AI is headed, why it matters to you, and what questions we should probably all be asking. So let's dive in.
Well, AI as a concept, it's actually been around for ages, since 1956, really, as an academic field.
Wow, okay.
But it's had these cycles, moments of huge excitement, then periods they called AI winters where things kind of stalled, funding dried up.
Ah, right.
The real turning point, the thing that led to the boom we're seeing now,
Hmm.
that really kicked off after about 2012.
Okay, so what was different then? What changed?
A few things sort of came together. One really crucial thing was researchers started using graphics processing units, GPUs, much more widely.
The things from video games.
Yeah, exactly. They were designed for rendering graphics, but they turned out to be amazing for speeding up the training of artificial neural networks.
Ah.
It just dramatically accelerated how quickly and how well these networks could learn.
And that links directly to deep learning, I guess.
Precisely. Deep learning uses these neural networks, but with lots and lots of layers.
Mm-hmm.
That's the deep part.
Gotcha.
And with those GPUs helping out, these deep networks started blowing past older AI methods on complex tasks, things like recognizing images, understanding speech.
Okay.
Then, building on that, the transformer architecture came along in 2017. That was another huge leap, especially for handling sequential data, like text.
Right, language.
Yeah, and that architecture. It's pretty fundamental to most of the large language models we hear about constantly today.
So it's like a combination. Faster processing from GPUs, plus smarter ways to structure the AI, like transformers. That really set the stage for what we have now, these generative tools that can actually create content.
That's it. Generative AI, the type that makes text, images, even computer code, just from a simple prompt that's the most visible result of this recent wave.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It really is, and it's shown incredible capabilities, but because it popped up so quickly and spread so widely, it immediately brought a lot of the potential downsides and harms into sharp focus,
Uh-huh.
which is why ethics and regulation suddenly became such a central part of the conversation.
Okay. You mentioned harms, downsides. What are some of the really significant ones that the sources highlight?
Well, misuse is a huge one. We're already seeing AI used in cyber attacks, like creating really sophisticated phishing emails that are hard to spot,
Right.
or generating incredibly convincing fake content, deep fakes, synthetic news reports. That stuff can be used for manipulation, fraud, propaganda.
Yeah.
It's worrying.
Yeah.
The ease with which you can now create realistic fake content it's a totally new kind of challenge.
That is unsettling. And what about jobs? That seems to be a massive worry for a lot of people.
It absolutely is. These generative AI tools are proving they can do tasks that humans used to do, and that
Yeah.
definitely raises concerns about, large-scale job displacement.
Yeah.
The sources actually point to some pretty stark examples, like how generative AI tools reportedly wiped out something like 70% of the jobs for video game illustrators in China.
Wow, 70%. That's
Yeah.
huge.
It's massive. It really shows just how fast some roles can be impacted. And another related issue is intellectual property, right?
Yeah.
Because these models are trained on these enormous data sets, and that data includes copyrighted work. So the models can then produce output that looks really similar to existing styles.
So who owns what?
Exactly. All the legal questions around fair use, ownership,
Right.
when it comes to the AI's training data and what it spits out, that's still being hotly debated.
Okay, so we've got digital misuse, job impacts, and are there physical world implications too, like infrastructure demands from these powerful AI systems?
Oh, absolutely. That's a really critical point that often gets missed in the headlines. Running and training these massive AI models takes an enormous amount of computing power.
Right, in data centers.
Huge data centers.
Yeah.
And those data centers, they just consume vast amounts of electricity. The International Energy Agency, they've put out forecasts saying the power demand from AI in data centers could potentially double by 2026.
Double.
Double, consuming as much electricity as, like, an entire country. Japan was the example given.
That's staggering. That kind of demand must be putting immense pressure on energy grids, driving interest in, well, new power sources.
It certainly is. Tech companies are building these data centers like crazy, making them gigantic power consumers.
Mm-hmm.
The need is getting so critical, they're actively looking into major investments in power generation themselves, including nuclear power.
Seriously, nuclear.
Yeah, we've seen news reports directly linking to this. Amazon buying a data center complex powered by nuclear. Microsoft announcing an agreement possibly tied to reopening the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant just to power their operations.
Wow.
It just shows how deeply AI is starting to impact really fundamental infrastructure.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Away from the infrastructure, maybe, and more towards how these systems actually work and the challenges that come just from that process itself.
Right. Let's look at some things inherent to machine learning. And one of the biggest challenges, which the sources really emphasize, is algorithmic bias.
Okay, bias. How does that actually creep into AI systems?
Well, it's mostly because AI works by finding statistical patterns, associations in the data it's trained on.
Makes sense.
So if that data reflects biases that already exist in society, maybe because of historical decisions or how the data was collected or just societal prejudices, the AI model learns those biases
And then repeats them.
and perpetuates them in its own outputs and decisions.
Yeah.
This can lead straight to algorithmic discrimination, where the AI ends up treating certain groups unfairly.
So the bias isn't necessarily like programmed in deliberately by the developers. It's more a reflection of the world that data came from.
Exactly, precisely. There's a classic example, the Google Photos incident, where the system mistakenly tagged pictures of Black people as gorillas.
Oh, I remember that. Awful.
Terrible.
Yeah.
But it wasn't malicious intent, right? It was likely due to sample size disparity. The training data just didn't have enough diverse examples. And the fix they had to implement, which was basically stopping the system from labeling anything as a gorilla, shows how difficult it is to truly correct these biases once they're learned.
Yeah.
The sources talk about trying things like fairness through blindness, just removing obvious markers like race or gender from the data.
Does that work?
Often no, because other data points, like zip codes or certain purchasing habits, can correlate strongly with those characteristics anyway. So the AI can often still infer the underlying bias and act on it.
And if the AI is trained on data that includes, say, biased past decisions like who got loans or who faced harsher sentences in the justice system.
Then it will learn to make those same biased decisions going forward.
Yeah.
That's a really crucial point. And it gets to a fundamental limitation of machine learning. It's fundamentally based on the assumption that the future will look like the past, which makes AI systems inherently less suited for tasks where we're actively trying to change things, right? Where we want the future to be better or different than historical trends. It describes the past data. It doesn't prescribe a desired future.
And adding another layer of complexity, especially with these really big, deep neural networks, is the black box problem.
Yes, exactly. The lack of transparency. Many of these incredibly complex AI systems are just so intricate. Even the people who designed them can't fully trace the step-by-step reasoning behind a specific decision it makes.
So you don't know why it decided something?
Not always, not fully.
Hmm.
You know what decision the AI made, but pinpointing the why can be incredibly difficult. And that makes it really hard to reliably find the source of errors or bias, and even harder to implement fixes you can trust.
Okay, so we've got these amazing opportunities, but also these really significant risks we're wrestling with. How are governments, organizations around the world starting to respond to all this?
Regulation is definitely becoming a major focus everywhere. The number of laws, regulations related to AI being drafted and passed, it's shot up significantly in just the last few years.
Yeah.
Lots of countries now have developed national AI strategies to kind of guide their approach.
I feel like I've heard about things happening in the US and Europe particularly.
Yeah, definitely. The U.S. has been working on something called a Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, laying out principles for responsible AI use.
Okay.
In Europe, the European Commission put out ethical guidelines quite early, and the EU is pretty far along with its big AI Act, which aims to regulate AI based on different levels of risk.
Makes sense.
And beyond just national stuff, there are global collaborations too, like the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, GPAI, which focuses on trying to align AI development with human rights and democratic values.
Uh-huh.
There have also been calls from some really prominent figures for government commissions to oversee AI development. The UN has launched an advisory body, and the Council of Europe recently created what's being called the first international legally binding treaty specifically on AI.
A treaty, wow. And we're seeing big international summits focused just on this too, aren't we?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Events like the one at Bletchley Park in the UK, and then the follow-up AI Seoul Summit. They brought together countries, even the big AI companies themselves, to talk about urgent issues like AI safety and try to establish some commitments.
So the whole regulatory landscape is really complex, moving fast.
Very fast. It reflects just how global AI's impact really is.
Okay, let's pivot now, maybe zoom in on the specific focus of that Department of Education report you mentioned earlier. How does all of this, the tech, the risks, the regulation, how does it impact teaching and learning specifically? What are the key things from that source?
Well, the report definitely acknowledges the growing interest
Mhm.
and, the potential for AI in education. It sees it's being driven by these broader changes in society,
Right.
but it really emphasizes the need for careful policy guidance. It basically lays out 4 foundational pillars for bringing AI into education responsibly.
What are they?
Promoting transparency, building trust, and making sure the systems are trustworthy, rigorously evaluating the quality and effectiveness of the AI models being used, and deeply understanding both the opportunities and those significant risks involved.
And does it pick up on that point we talked about earlier about AI models just being approximations of reality?
Oh, absolutely. It hits that point hard, and it's really fundamental to how the report frames responsible AI use in schools. It stresses that decision makers, teachers, administrators need transparency, not just knowing that AI is being used.
But how it works?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How it works, what data it was trained on, and critically, what its inherent limitations and risks are. Every AI model, it says, is an incomplete picture of reality. Understanding where and why it might fail, or why it might not accurately capture what's truly important for a student's learning, that's absolutely essential for educators.
And the report makes a really strong point about context, doesn't it? Especially the context that human teachers bring.
Yes, this is highlighted as a key strength of human educators, something AI currently really struggles with. The report gives this great example. Imagine a teacher sees 3 students all make the same basic math error.
Okay.
An AI might just flag the error pattern. But the human teacher understands the context behind each student's mistake. Maybe one student has vision problems and misread the question.
Right.
Another might have a genuine misunderstanding of the concept. And maybe the third is just completely distracted because they had a fight on the playground earlier.
Yeah, totally different reasons.
Totally different. And knowing that context is vital for knowing how to actually help each student effectively. AI systems often just lack the data, or maybe the capacity, to interpret and apply context in that really nuanced human way.
And that leads right into one of the report's core recommendations, I imagine.
It does, directly. The report strongly argues for a vision of AI in education where humans stay fundamentally in the loop, meaning teachers should be the ones making the major instructional decisions. They should be interpreting student needs, conducting assessments that really inform teaching. AI tools can support those processes, maybe by noticing patterns or organizing data,
But the human decides.
but humans, especially teachers, must set the learning goals and stay in control of the critical decisions about individual students and the overall direction of education. AI should be seen as automating tasks to help achieve human-defined goals, not defining the goals themselves.
Okay, so given that really human-centric focus, what specific opportunities does the report see for AI to genuinely help teachers and students?
Well, one of the biggest potentials they see is in reducing the administrative burden, the kind of low-level stuff that takes up so much teacher time.
Like grading multiple choice?
Yeah,
Or,
maybe, but also things like acting as an assistant, helping teachers remember to follow up with specific students, organizing learning resources, maybe even potentially cutting down on that average weekly prep time, which is, substantial right now.
how substantial?
The report mentions estimates suggesting AI could potentially reduce prep time from around 11 hours a week down to maybe 6.
Wow, freeing up 5 hours a week.
Yeah,
That would let teachers focus much more on actual teaching, connecting with students.
exactly. That's the hope. AI could also potentially help by flagging students or groups who might be struggling and need more personalized attention from the teacher.
Okay.
And it could assist in professional development, too. Like, imagine it analyzing classroom recordings to provide objective feedback on things like teacher-student interaction patterns,
Mm.
stuff that's really hard for a teacher to track accurately themselves in the moment.
That's interesting. How does AI fit in with supporting the sheer diversity of students you find in any classroom?
Yeah, this is where they bring in the concept of the long tail of
Mhm.
learner variability.
The long tail.
Yeah, think of a statistical distribution like a bell curve. Standard teaching often has to focus on meeting the needs of the majority of students. That's the big hump in the middle of the peak.
Okay.
But students vary enormously, right? In their strengths, their needs, backgrounds, learning styles,
Mhm.
all that variation stretching out from the average, that's the long tail. Lots of different needs, but maybe fewer students with each specific one.
And AI could potentially help address more of those specific, less common needs out on the tail?
That's the potential the report outlines.
Yeah.
AI could theoretically help address a much wider spectrum of these diverse needs than current systems really allow.
How so?
It might help customize learning resources for neurodiverse learners, for example, or provide content that's more responsive to specific local cultures or communities, or maybe offer different pathways through learning material based on how an individual student is responding.
But there's a catch.
It is a big but. The report cautions that actually achieving this requires developers to deliberately focus on supporting that long tail. They need to incorporate the context that makes learning meaningful and move beyond just superficial ideas of personalization that we saw in some earlier educational tech.
Right, not just faster or slower, but different. Okay, what about the key risks? Specifically, the risks of using AI within education itself.
The risk of that algorithmic discrimination we talked about earlier is probably the most significant one mentioned. Biased AI systems could end up perpetuating or even worsening existing inequities within schools.
How?
Well, if systems are trained on biased data about student performance or behavior, they could unfairly track students into different streams, assess them inaccurately, or recommend interventions based on flawed assumptions.
That's worrying.
Definitely. Another risk is that even if AI automates some tasks, it could inadvertently shift new, unexpected responsibilities or workloads onto teachers, kind of canceling out the hoped-for benefits.
Oh, yeah, the unintended consequences.
Exactly. So the report really stresses the critical need for robust systems to monitor for bias and other unwanted effects after these AI tools are put into use, and highlights the importance of involving teachers and students directly in designing and rolling out these technologies.
That makes a lot of sense. Wow, that's a tremendous amount to think about. We've kind of journeyed all the way from the technical roots of this AI boom.
Yeah, deep learning transformers.
Right. Through its broad societal impacts, the risks like job losses, energy use.
Misinformation bias.
And then we really zeroed in specifically on how it could reshape education using the insights from these sources.
Yeah, we've seen how these innovations brought incredible new capabilities, but also, introduced really significant challenges.
Hmm.
From the very real potential for job disruption and those massive demands on our power grids.
Right, the nuclear power angle.
Yeah, to the fundamental issues baked into machine learning itself, like how easily it can pick up bias from skewed data and the difficulty of understanding those complex black box decisions.
And that U.S. Department of Education report gave us a really grounded perspective on how this could actually play out in classrooms. It laid out the opportunities how AI might lighten teacher workloads, maybe help support that long tail of diverse student needs.
While crucially emphasizing that humans, teachers, students, have to stay central. They need to be empowered and kept in the loop when it comes to the core goals and decisions in education.
Right. AI as a tool, not the master.
Exactly. And we also touched on those rapidly growing global efforts to actually regulate AI, which shows just how widely recognized its potential impact and its risks really are. Understanding these nuances, really getting that AI models are statistical guesses, that they can miss vital context, that their intelligence is fundamentally different from ours, is just crucial for everyone navigating this changing world, whether you're building AI, using the tools, or just trying to make sense of it all.
So building on that, here's a final thought to leave you with. It picks up on that point about AI models being based on past data. The Department of Education report specifically noted that this limitation can perpetuate biases. And it might mean AI isn't well suited for areas where we actively hope the future will be better than the past. So, given that, how should we think about the role of AI? Not just in, say, automating the world as it currently is, based on all that historical data, but in actually helping us build the world we want it to be.